Charlie Chaplin. He was known as the Little Tramp. With his distinctive mustache, ill-fitting costume, and quirky walk, Chaplin is the most recognizable star of the silent screen era.
But after decades of celebrity and acclaim, Charlie Chaplin became the subject of scrutiny and scandal. At the age of 55, his sexual appetite and his controversial political beliefs ripped Chaplin from the limelight and shattered his career. Why was Chaplin a target of the FBI? What obsession landed this beloved comedian on trial, and how did Chaplin end up in exile? And in the most bizarre twist, what shocking incident occurred after Chaplin was laid to rest? On this episode of Mysteries and Scandals, we'll examine the harsh reality of Chaplin's sexcapades.
It turned into almost a fatal attraction.
It very quickly came to the attention of the FBI.
He had to get out from one of these scandals or another.
And we'll identify Chaplin's accusers and their bitter charges against him.
My guess is, with at least as much influence on the part of the FBI as Joan herself, that a paternity suit against Chaplin should be filed.
The accusations in terms of Joan Barry, the accusations in terms of communist sympathies, ended Chaplin's career in the United States.
Charlie Chaplin's public ruin will be recounted through archival footage and classic film clips, as well as rare photographs and dramatic reenactments.
I'm A.J. Benza. Join me as we look at the scandalous downfall of a comic legend, Charlie Chaplin.
On Christmas morning in 1977, a wealthy and reclusive Charlie Chaplin died of old age at his estate in Switzerland. This Hollywood icon was born 88 years earlier in the ghettos of London on April 16, 1889. His parents, Charles and Hannah Chaplin, were vaudeville performers. Chaplin biographer Wes Gehring reveals that young Charlie learned at an early age how brutal an audience can be.
His mother, Hannah, basically lost her voice, and the audience was very disruptive, and she kind of lost her composure and couldn't go on, and basically almost booed off the stage.
Chaplin's mother was traumatized by the public humiliation, but the incident gave 4-year-old Charlie his first break into showbiz. Bonnie McCourt is the publisher of the Charlie Chaplin fan magazine, Limelight.
He just, became totally animated and did his little song and dance, and people loved him and threw money, and he ran and got all the money off the stage, and he basically stood in for his mother and saved the day.
His father was an alcoholic and basically abandoned the family at a very young age, and literally died an alcoholic just a few years later.
Life with Mom was no party either. Author Joyce Milton explains young Charlie had to grow up fast.
Chaplin's mother had a number of mental breakdowns. She was very close to him.
She became mentally ill and was put in a mental institution. And here's this little 7-year-old boy in a workhouse, which in South London was the worst shame you could ever endure.
Charlie overcame his shame by calling upon his innate ability to make people laugh. He performed in local productions and variety shows, and at the age of 18, Charlie finally broke out of the amateur ranks.
Sidney Chaplin was Chaplin's half-brother, and they were very close throughout Chaplin's life, and they sort of looked out for each other. And Sidney Chaplin, pulled the little strings to get his younger brother this audition. It wasn't very long before Charlie Chaplin was, a recognized star, and then he came over to the United States.
In 1913, on that trip, he was signed to a film contract by Max Sennett, who was the premier film comedy producer in America at that time.
Max Sennett's Keystone Film Company was the training ground for many silent screen clowns, including Buster Keaton and Fatty Arbuckle. It was at Keystone that Charlie first created his signature character, the Little Tramp.
And he went over to the makeup table and he cut up a little mustache and put on a little mustache and asked Fatty Arbuckle if he could borrow his pants, and went over and got a pair of Ford Sterling shoes and got found a little tiny jacket, a little hat, kind of walked around and just kind of strutting his stuff, his character that he created, which is the most hopeful character that there is.
In 1914, his first year at Keystone, 27-year-old Charlie starred in 35 films. writing and directing more than half of them. His career was on the fast track, and Charlie Chaplin was quickly becoming a household name.
The second year that Chaplin was in films, he was signed to the S&A Film Company. When he worked for Keystone, he was making $125 a week. At the end of that year, he was signed to a contract for S&A for $1,250 a week. Left there, signed with the Mutual Film Company for a total of $670,000. And then in 1918, he signed the first $1 million film contract with the First National Film Company.
Wow, $1 million in 1918. That's a lot of dough no matter what year it is. And all before he turned 30, Charlie Chaplin had come a long way from the London slums of his childhood. He even formed his own studio right here in the heart of Hollywood. Charlie Chaplin was the man, but off-screen, the guy had some big problems. He had a sexual obsession that would eventually destroy his career. When we come back, we're going to expose the shocking personal life of the little tramp, Charlie Chaplin. By 1918, the career of 29-year-old silent screen star Charlie Chaplin was flourishing. With his $1 million film contract, Charlie was the toast of Hollywood. But this comic giant had a weakness. You see, Charlie just couldn't resist a pretty young girl.
His first wife was Mildred Harris. She was 17 when they were married in 1918. He seems to have thought she was pregnant, and she wasn't pregnant at that time. There was a suggestion that he was tricked into that, and then when he found out it was a trick, it was over.
When Chaplin's first marriage ended, there was some scandal, but basically the press sided with Chaplin, and they were willing to forgive him anything.
But how long would the press support Chaplin? Film historian Anthony Slide describes Chaplin's second underage conquest.
During the making of The Kid, Chaplin met for the first time Lita Grey. She was then obviously a young girl, probably about 12, 13 years old.
A few years later, she auditioned for and won the lead in The Gold Rush, which would go on to be Chaplin's greatest film. Early in the production of that, she got pregnant.
What was with this guy? His affair with Lita Grey was doomed from the beginning.
Her pregnancy forced her to drop out of the movie. And once again, I think he treated her quite badly. He was, after they were married.
She did go on to have Charlie Chaplin Jr., and then they had another son together, Sidney Chaplin, named after Chaplin's brother.
After the birth of their second child, the marriage fell apart. Lita Grey filed for divorce in 1926. The heated and much publicized court proceedings lasted 8 months and cost Chaplin more than his good name.
It cost him, with lawyers' fees, about $1 million, which was the biggest settlement up to that date.
Chaplin had a nervous breakdown in 1927 during the midst of this. It was constant headlines. I mean, Scandal City. It was a major controversy.
The press had a field day, but it was only the beginning. 5 years later, in 1932, 45-year-old Chaplin became involved with 21-year-old cinema star Paulette Goddard. That relationship didn't last either. But despite a chaotic personal life, the 1930s marked a period of artistic achievement and acclaim for Charlie Chaplin. David Totherow, grandson of Chaplin's cameraman, believes Chaplin's 1931 movie City Lights is one of the shining moments in film history.
Anyone who has seen City Lights knows there is more just plain human emotion comes through.
With modern times, a political element enters Chaplin's films. Here he's dealing with that age-old problem of capital versus labor.
Chaplin continued to push his political opinions in his next film, The Great Dictator, released to theaters in 1940. The movie made fun of Hitler and opened a huge can of worms for the 51-year-old Chaplin. Now, you got to remember, before the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the U.S. didn't want any involvement in World War II, and Charlie was daring the U.S. to stand behind Russia. Chaplin analyst Stephen Weissman says the pro-communist message of The Great Dictator raised red flags to J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI.
Before World War II broke out, the House of Un-American Activities Committee was originally formed in 1938 to investigate people advocating America going into war, doing other subversive things. The first piece of trouble, as I mentioned, was The Great Dictator.
He's trying to find humor out of the Nazis, out of Adolf Hitler.
So to make a film that ridiculed Hitler, held him up to scorn, was to win over sympathy of many people towards the anti-Hitler sentiment. you have to realize that many, many people did not want to go to war against Germany at all.
J. Edgar Hoover was determined to drive Chaplin out of the country.
In the midst of Chaplin's political faux pas, he started dating a woman named Joan Barry. Now, she was ancient by Chaplin standards. Joan was 22. Charlie was 52. Chaplin would soon learn that Joan was a disaster with a capital D. Or would that be a double D?
Joan Barry was a 22-year-old, very big-busted and apparently attractive, sexy woman who Charlie was taken with. She already had a police record for shoplifting. She was an alcoholic, had made several suicide attempts.
Communication professor Dr. Gerard Molyneux recalls Joan Barry's most desperate act.
December 23rd, 1943, she shows up at his house and is trying to get into the house, knocking on the door, and he's ignoring her. She finds a ladder and starts to try to get into the second floor and doesn't make that. Comes back down the ladder and breaks the glass on the library doors, starts to say, you know, why is our romance breaking up? She is threatening to kill herself.
She was furious because he was in love with and getting involved with Una O'Neill, who was his latest romance, and she was intensely jealous of that.
At some point, it turned out that Joan was pregnant. Joan was in connection with several people who were interested in making sure that anything unseemly about Chaplin got known and might be utilized.
In 1942, the FBI and Joan Barry had the same goal, to crucify Chaplin. But was he really the communist traitor, womanizer the FBI and Barry alleged? Or was Charlie Chaplin targeted because he was famous? When we come back, we'll look at the dishonorable discharge of a renowned comic hero. Between marriages, Charlie would often shack up here at what is now the Hollywood Athletic Club. And considering Chaplin's record with women in those days, it's probably a second home to Charlie back then. Welcome back to Mysteries and Scandals. I'm A.J. Benzo. In 1942, after a history of romances with young, and I'm talking young women, Charlie landed in hot water. His 22-year-old lover, Joan Barry, accused the 53-year-old Chaplin of getting her pregnant. What's more, the FBI was on his back because he seemed to be a communist sympathizer, making speeches in support of Russia. To the FBI, Chaplin seemed like a traitor.
Chaplin was asked to stand in and make a presentation, a speech in San Francisco, where he made the unfortunate choice of addressing the members of the audience as comrades.
I think he was sympathetic towards communism. I think just about, well, everybody in the arts that leaned a little bit to the left was sympathetic.
The FBI's file on Charlie Chaplin was reportedly 1,900 pages. The file included detailed accounts of his political activities and his romantic involvements. In the 1940s, famed Hollywood gossip columnist Hedda Hopper was eager to share her scoops on Chaplin with the FBI.
She would feed as much information as she could to the FBI.
When Joan Barry found out that she was pregnant, she thought by Chaplin, she went to Hedda Hopper for help because Hedda had written a column about all Charlie's past girls.
The 1943 paternity suit filed by Joan Barry stated that Charlie Chaplin got her pregnant and abandoned her. Chaplin was convinced the child wasn't his, but given his reputation, he knew the press would butcher him. And to make matters worse, Chaplin's latest girlfriend, Una O'Neill, was, you guessed it, a teenager.
Una moved into his house. This was when she was about 17. His lawyer advised him to send Una away, send her back to New York, and she refused to go. But since she refused to be sent away, at that point, there wasn't much he could do, and so he married her.
Charlie and his young bride braced themselves for the paternity trial. Besides Joan Barry's accusations, there were additional charges against Chaplin. For one, Charlie was accused by the FBI of violating a federal law called the Mann Act that made it illegal to transport any women across state lines for illicit or immoral purposes.
This trip to New York that he had financed for Joan Barry and her mother, he also was in New York for a political rally. And when she brought forth her charges about Chaplin was the person that had made her pregnant and everything, and she claimed sexual relations in New York, her lawyers decided to go after Chaplin on the Mann Act.
Chaplin was not convicted of the Mann Act, but it didn't matter. By the time he was done, he was tarnished.
Chaplin went to trial, charged with being the father of Joan's child.
The first trial, the jury is 7-5, and Chaplin gets off.
So Joan Barry decided to go after Chaplin in a second trial. She had a hotshot lawyer named Joseph Scott.
Scott is into histrionics and pulpit and looks like the wrath of God to start with. He's 77 years old and on a mission, on a crusade to get Chaplin.
11 of the 12 jurors were women, and this one went against him. He lost the court case and was going to pursue it further, and it was just too messy, and he just sort of backed away from it.
Chaplin always maintained that Barry's kid wasn't his, but what are you going to do? The U.S. Attorney General at the time, James P. McGranary, considered Chaplin an immoral menace to society.
McGranary was determined to get him, and as soon as he got into office, he said, FBI, give me what you have on Chaplin. The FBI gave him 7 volumes on Chaplin's morals and 6 volumes on his politics.
Under intense public scrutiny, Chaplin decided with his next film he'd take a different approach.
And he starts to try to recast himself to get back to the old Chaplin in a film called Limelight.
He planned a trip to celebrate the opening of his film Limelight in England and France. He sailed with his family, and no sooner were they offshore than the next day he got word that the Attorney General was pulling his visa.
It was announced that if Chaplin chose to re-enter the country, he would have to appear and answer questions as to his political and moral fitness.
In 1953, at the age of 64, Charlie Chaplin went into a self-imposed exile. He had never become a U.S. citizen, but he had always considered America his home. Now he felt his adopted country had betrayed him, and public opinion here in the States suggested the feeling was mutual. But still, questions remain. Was Chaplin really a communist? Was he really the father of Joan Barry's kid? And what happened to Chaplin's body after his death? Answers revealed when we come back. Silent screen star Charlie Chaplin left the United States in 1953 after years of political controversy, personal scandal, and negative press. So what truth was there to justify Chaplin's persecution and exile? Let's start by looking at Chaplin's ex-lover, Joan Barry. She insisted that Chaplin was the father of her baby and even won a hefty court settlement. But Charlie wasn't the only bigwig on Joan Barry's dance card. Before and after hooking up with Chaplin and suing him for child support, Barry, get this, was also sleeping with oil tycoon J. Paul Getty. So as promised, let's set the record straight. Was Charlie Chaplin the father of Joan Barry's child?
Joan was, shall we say, pretty active in the community.
Even when she was with Chaplin, she'd be going back to J. Paul Getty's house.
Blood tests done at the time scientifically prove in an absolute fashion that is totally valid today that he could never have been the father of this child, but they were not admitted into evidence.
And what about the FBI's allegations that Chaplin was a communist?
He did support communism in Russia. He did support Stalin.
If they had put him under oath and said, are you now or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party, he could have said no.
So for 20 years, Chaplin lived in exile in Europe with his wife Una and their 8 children. Then, as so often happens, the movers and shakers of Hollywood had a change of heart. In 1972, the Academy of Motion Pictures Arts and Sciences decided to honor Chaplin with a special Oscar. Robert Wise is the former president of the Academy.
There was a tribute to him at the Motion Picture Academy. He spoke very, very well, was very moving and very delighted to be back and all. And it was a very, very special event for the Motion Picture Academy.
It was sort of America saying we're sorry.
It was just so wonderful that Hollywood really showed that they respected what this man did, and whether they agreed with him politically or not, it was the work that really was the focus.
In 1977, 5 years after he returned to the U.S. to accept the Academy's tribute, Charlie Chaplin died. Ironically, even in death, Chaplin was the focus of a scandal.
His body was stolen by some men who wanted to finance a garage, and they figured they'd steal the body and hold it for ransom. Chaplin was very into the macabre when he was alive. I think he would have kind of laughed at this whole situation because it was just so bizarre that they stole his body.
Eventually, the grave robbers were caught, and Charlie's body was returned. In spite of all the uproar over his political and moral behavior, Charlie Chaplin was very much a family man later in his life,
and will always be considered one of the greats of film comedy.
Chaplin, as a filmmaker, will always be one of those pioneers who, by sheer power of his performance ability, captured the hearts of more people than anyone has before or since.
What is there to fight for? Everything! Life itself, isn't that enough?
Life was not a beautiful place. He made movies about the real issues of life later on in his film career. The movies became really about what it is to be a human being.
Now is the time to show them what you're made of. Now is the time to fight.
Like the characters he portrayed, Charlie Chaplin was human with maybe more than his fair share of human frailties. And like so many others, he sometimes let his star power get in the way of good judgment. But Chaplin was an artist. His impact in Hollywood is undeniable. I'm A.J. Benza. Join me the next time we take a stroll down the flip side of the Walk of Fame.